For lesson 77 in the purple group, we're going to start with your textbook. So get your textbook and workbook and Notability ready, and we'll start the lesson on the next slide. Once you're done working through all of the parts, show it to a teacher so that they can check to let you know where you need to make corrections for. And then once you've shown it to a teacher and they have told you where to make corrections and you've done the corrections, once you're done doing the corrections, then you can start on the independent work for the lesson. So for part 1 in your textbook, you're going to round each numeral. Remember that the arrow digit is going to show the place that you'll round to. So if the arrow digit is pointing, the arrow is pointing to the hundreds, that means you're going to round to the hundreds. Everything after the hundreds becomes 0. And when we look next door, remember we have to decide if the arrow digit is going to go up or stay the same, if the next door is 5 or above. So look at A. We have it arrowed to the hundreds place. So that means that I'm going to look next door and I have to decide whether the hundreds place is going to go up or stay the same. So remember that everything before the arrow is going to stay the same. So the 4,000, the 4 in the thousands place will stay the same. So now I'm looking at the 0 in the hundreds place, and I'm going to look next door to the 8. And I have to ask myself, is 8 5 or above? And yes, it is above 5, which means that the 0 in the hundreds place will go up. So the hundreds place will become 1, from 0 to 1. And then remember that after we round, everything after the arrow becomes a 0. So 4,082 will round to 4,100. When you're starting out with B, now here we're rounding the thousands place. So I have to look next door to the 0, ask myself if it's 5 or above, and it's not 5 or above, which means that the 7 is going to stay the same. So, and then everything after it becomes 0. So remember that you're going to make the decision whether to go up or stay the same for the arrow number. And then once you make the decision from looking next door, is it 5 or above, then you're going to make everything after that into zeros. So go ahead and pause the video, work all the problems in part 1, and then come back for part 2. So for part 2, the instructions say for each item you're going to make a number family with 3 letters. In each of the problems, the information about the whole angle or one of the smaller angles is not given. And if you see here, one of the problems even tells about a fraction of a circle. So you're going to use that fact to work the problem. So here it says that angle M is 2/5 of a circle. We know that angle R is 250 degrees. And so we have to figure out angle N. So before we can start, we have to solve to even figure out what number of degrees 2/5 of a circle is. So in order to figure that out, if they tell us that it's 2/5 of a circle, I know that I'm going to use the number 2/5. And when I see the word of, when I'm trying to translate from words into math, I know of means times. And what you have to remember is the fact when we see the words of a circle, we know that a circle is 360. So remember that. So 2/5 times or of a circle is 360. And then I work this the same way that I would do a multiplication of a fraction problem. So I can't just multiply a whole number here. I have to change it into a fraction. And any whole number has a hidden number 1 underneath it. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply straight across the top like I always would. So 2 times 360 will get you to 720. And then I multiply straight across the bottom. 5 times 1 is 5. So now I've gotten a fraction, but that still hasn't told me the number of degrees that to put into my number family. So I have to take this fraction and change it into a whole number. So what I'll do is I'll take my calculator and I'll do 720 divided by 5. And once I put that into the calculator, I now know that 2/5 of a circle is 144 degrees. So now all I've done is I've figured out angle M. Instead of knowing that it's 2/5 of a circle, I've now solved to know that angle M is 144 degrees. So now I'm ready to make the number family because now I know angle M and angle R, and that's enough to make my number family to figure out angle N. So when I go to make my number family, I know that the three letters are M, N, and R, and I can see here, because the yellow part is so big, that R is going to be my big number. And I can know that M and N will both be small numbers because they're smaller parts, that when I add together these two smaller parts, it will equal the big angle or the big number that I have. So now I plug in the numbers that I know. I know that angle M, from what we've solved, angle M will be 144. And I know from the problem that they gave us that angle R is 250. So now that I have put together my number family, I see that I'm missing a small number. So I'd have to subtract 250 minus 44. So go ahead and figure out what angle N is to finish solving this problem. And then you're just going to do the same thing for B and C. So if you're not sure all of the steps, rewind and watch the explanation that I did for A, because you're going to have to do here this fraction 1/4 of a circle. You're going to have to set it up just like this. You'd have 1/4 times the 360. 360 degrees is what I put in place of the circle. And then I'm going to use that to figure out what angle R is. Once I've figured out what this fraction will be when I change it into degrees, when I use this step right here, then I will be able to make my number family to figure out the missing degrees for angle R. So like I said, re-watch it if you're not sure the steps, and then try to apply the steps. Try to use those steps using the information for B and for C. So pause the video, try and work the problems using the steps that we've done, and then come back for the next part. So for part 3 of your textbook, I'm going to read what it says, and then you can follow along. It says that you've worked with sentences that compare letters. These sentences you've worked with have the word of. Sentences that do not have the word of work the same way. So here's a sentence that compares. F is 7/5 as much as R. So you're comparing something to R, which means that R is 1. F is more than R, so F is the big number. So here's the family with F is the big number and R is 1. So since the thing that we know is F, and we're comparing it to R, so when we're comparing something to that letter, the letter that is being compared to is 1. And since we know that F is more than R, we know it's more than R because the fraction that they gave us is more than 1. That makes F the big number. And then I'm able to figure out the fraction number family to figure out what the difference between the two is. So here's another sentence. T is 5/6 as long as Y. So here's the family with T is the small number and Y is 1. So we know T, and since we don't know Y, we're going to make Y a fraction of 1. But this time, the fraction of 1 is the big number because the fraction that they gave us, 5/6, is less than 1. So if this is less than 1, we know that 1 is bigger and will be the big number. And then we solve for the difference just like we always do. So for part 4 of the workbook, we're going to practice this. Remember that we're comparing something to the last letter. These are the last letters. That's what we're comparing to, which means that these letters are all going to be equal to 1. So we have to figure out then whether the first letter or the last letter will be the big number or a small number, and then we're going to make the family. So let's work A together. Make my number family for A. And it says that P is 5/6 as tall as H. So I know that I'm comparing to H, so H is going to be the fraction that's equal to 1. But I still have to decide whether H will be a big number or a small number. So I'm going to look here. Since we know that P is 5/6, 5/6 is less than 1. And since P is less than 1 and H is 1, H is going to be more because it's the big number, because H is equal to 1 and P is less than 1. So we know that P is 5/6. I know that in a fraction number family, they all have to have the same bottom number. And we know that since H is the last letter of the sentence, it has to be equal to 1. So if my top number and bottom number match, then I know that this fraction is equal to 1. So to find out the difference, my bottom number stays the same, and then I solve the subtraction for the family just like I would. So the difference between the two is 1/6. So go ahead and solve the rest of them in this problem. What you're going to do is you have to know that T here is equal to 1. Here, R is 9/7. And when you look at that, you have to decide if that is more than 1, which it is, that would make R the big number. And you're going to set up a number family with R being the big number and T being the small number with a fraction that is equal to 1. So go ahead and work part 4. Make sure to ask for help if you need it, but try and rewind the video to watch the example problem and listen to the explanation in part 3 so that you can try and solve it first on your own, and then you can always go back and make corrections later. So give it a try, pause the video, and then come back for the next part. So the next section, if you want to call this part O, this is more of a mental math problem, so this one's not in your book. So I'm going to be reading you the problems, and I want you to solve them. I'm going to show you how to set up part of problem A, just so that you know what I'm asking for, but then I want you to try to solve it based on how I read the problem. So the problems are going to tell about something where I've got more than one of that thing, and I'm going to try to figure out how much just one of that thing is, how much it costs or how much it weighs. So for problem A, it says 5 boxes hold 88 grams. So I'm telling you about 5 boxes. So I know that 5 boxes will equal 88 grams. And what I need to try to figure out is how much one box would weigh. So you're going to put the equation underneath where 1 box will equal how many grams. So try to remember how to get it from 5 down to 1, and then how many grams would it be if I just had 1 box. So I'll read A again. A says that 5 boxes holds 88 grams. So you're going to write the equation to figure out how many grams 1 box holds. You can pause the video here while you solve it. I'm going to go ahead and read problem B. So B says that 2 bars cost 56 cents. So if 2 bars cost 56 cents, write the equation to figure out how much 1 bar costs. So pause the video while you solve it, or go back and rewind it if you want to hear it again. And then here's the last one, problem C. 100 pencils weigh 3 pounds. 100 pencils weigh 3 pounds. So write the equation for how many pounds 1 pencil would weigh. So pause the video while you solve for C. We're going to try and figure out how many grams or dollars or pounds one thing costs. So we've done these a few times. Try and give it your best try. And pause the video and come back for part 5 when you're ready. So these types of problems we started to work on the other day. You have to write each answer as a mixed number, which means that you're going to have a whole number and a fraction. And so the way that this works is that if I start first in the fraction column, right, I see that I've got nothing here. I've got nothing in that fraction column. So I've got nothing plus 7/15. So when I've got nothing plus 7/15, my answer in the fraction column is just going to stay 7/15. I'm not adding anything to it, so it's not changing. Then I just go and I add the whole numbers how I regularly would just add whole numbers. I have 8 plus 2 is 10, and 1 plus the 1 that I carried is 2. So my final answer would be 20 and 7/15. Same thing you do when you're subtracting. I've got 9/21, subtracting nothing. I've got nothing else in this fraction column. So 9/21 minus nothing is still going to give me 9/21 in the fraction column. And then I go through and just subtract how I always would. So go ahead and work these problems for part 5. Pause the video and then come back when you are ready for part 6. So the instructions for part 6, they tell you to find the area of each figure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down the formulas, and then you're going to solve the problem. So when I'm trying to find the area, if I'm talking about a triangle, which is equal to base times height divided by 2. And so remember, a triangle only has 3 sides. It's half of what we would need if it was a rectangle, so that's why we do base times height and we divide it by 2. When you're looking for area of a rectangle, and remember that rectangles have 4 sides, the formula that you use is just base times height. So those are the 2 formulas you're going to need when you're using a triangle formula. You're going to do base times height and then divide your answer by 2. If you are using a rectangle formula for the rectangle shapes, you just do base times height. So go ahead and solve the 3 problems for part 6. And then when you are done, come back for the next part. The last part is in your workbook. So after this part, get your workbook ready and we'll continue on the next slide. Okay, so for this part for workbook for lesson 77, the problem says the ratio of y to x is 2:4. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. If y comes first, I know that y is 2 and x is 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here on my coordinate grid and I'm going to make the point for y is equal to 2 and x is equal to 4. So I'm going to go ahead and make my point there. Okay, right there. And then you're going to take a ruler and make your line. I'm going to give it a try right here on the screen, but mine will not be straight, so don't use my line. Once you plot your own, your line will give you much more clear answers. So I'll give it a try. Yep, not very straight, but yours will be very straight. So what you're going to figure out then is if y is equal to 4, how much would x equal? So I could see here that if y is equal to 4, actually this is going to be messed up. I'm going to try my line one more time. So it'll give us the wrong answer. Better. Okay, so when y is equal to 4, and I have to come over to where my line is meeting y is equal to 4, that's where I come down here to figure out that x would equal 8. So if y equals 4, my line is going to hit, and that's how I know that my x is equal to 8. The way that you can check that is that I know here that if 2 times 2 equals 4, if I know that I can do a times 2, 2 times 2 equals 4, and I do the same thing on the bottom, it's true that 4 times 2 equals 8. Right? So when I'm looking at the next one, I need to see that my x is equal to 10. So I'm going to go over here that when my x is equal to 10, I need to find out where it's going to hit on the line. So it's going to hit right here. When x is equal to 10, here's where my line hits. And I'm going to come over and I figure out that my y is equal to 5. Okay? So I know that when the y is equal to 5, the x is equal to 10. So use your line, that's much straighter because you used a ruler. And when you use your line, you'll be able to figure out what these two x values are, and then write the answers in there. Once you're done with this section, that's the end of the lesson. So have the teacher check your answers and they will let you know where you need to go back and make corrections. And once you have done that, then you can start on the independent work for the lesson.